請
啊，先生，仲有一個位，請埋邊。
好啊。
先生，請。
好，
請，隨便啦。先生，慢慢彈啦。
唔該。
First of all, we should say that the film itself in the Cantonese original, in the Chinese original, has a slightly different title. In the Mandarin transliteration, that would have been Hongquan Da Shi, which means the great master of the triad fists. So the triads are, of course, the quintessential Hong Kong crime organization, and it's very important to remember that this organization had its roots in the 19th century and the 18th century, so before Hong Kong even came into existence. But during the time when Hong Kong was gathering wealth, it became an underground organization which the state, so the British colonial administration, found incredibly hard to control. And most of their money came from shadowy operations, which also included narcotics. And of course, at that point, it is not so in the 20th century, it's no longer the opium that you can see being consumed in the film, but the link is very directly there because the 19th century was the time when the whole of China, but via Canton, of which Hong Kong is part, became a place where opium was being peddled, where opium was being smuggled into, and then finally where it gained the status that it had in later years. So to the Hong Kong audience, the link between crime and opium is immediately evident, even though it's not part of the Chinese title.
如果我哋唔係賣咁平，邊有咁多人幫襯啊？
而家班煙民上晒癮，你想窮都幾難啊！
So the first Opium War grew out of a gradual a situation which gradually became more serious with the first the semi-legal, then the completely illegal transport of opium into places neighboring China. So the most important parts would be French Indochina, although that was not yet completely under the control of the French, but definitely the Dutch East Indies, which are more or less identical with today's southern parts of Malaysia and Indonesia. And once this had been established, this trading pattern, the British East India Company, which stuck to the letter of the law, namely not to import any opium into China, they closed both eyes when they, from the late 18th century onwards, allowed their traders to privately peddle opium into islands that were in the Pearl River Delta. So the Pearl River Delta is the Zhujiang in Chinese, is the river that connects Macau with Hong Kong and Canton. So it's like a triangle. And into this triangle, the traders who accepted bribes, so basically for smuggling the opium into the hinterland, they became ever bolder. And by the 1820s, all of a sudden you had a situation where the opium produced in the territories held by the British East India Company in eastern Bengal, so northeastern India, was reaching the interior of Canton province, Guangdong province. And in this situation, the state, namely the Qing Empire, the empire that was in power right until 1911, they decided to send a commissioner. That's the name of the commissioner is Lin Zexu. Lin is his family name, so Commissioner Lin. He had as his moral and political and administrative task the challenge to stop this opium trade, which was completely illegal according to a law of 1728. and then reinforced 1796. So these two laws made it completely illegal for any recreational opium to be shipped into China. So this is the background to the legal background to the opium conflict that is ensued. And then the question is, would this conflict by necessity have resulted in a war if the let's say if the Chinese had been more willing to negotiate rather than to use ultimate force and to destroy the opium that was on board of the ships that had arrived outside Guangzhou, outside Canton? Well, possibly, but the situation was also becoming more complicated because the British traders resented the fact that they had to pay for all the tea, the chinaware, the silk, and everything that ended up in Britain, that they had to pay for it in silver. And this was silver ingots, Mexican silver dollars, these reales, which you could cut into pieces because they were worth their value in weight. They simply thought there must be a better way. So they quite simply devised a system whereby they paid for all the Chinese exports in opium. And this was, of course, completely against all rules. And at this point, it was clear that the Qing authorities regarded the British traders as nothing but pirates, and they got their coastal defense forces to first elongate them from the trade port in Canton onto an island, Linding Island, which was very hard to control. And from that point onwards, they did essentially what all freebooters and traders would do. They smuggled the opium in the middle of the night into on barges into the hinterland, and this is something which the Chinese authorities definitely could not tolerate. And at this point, there was action taken, which the British traders wanted the British Navy to respond to by cannon power. And this cannon fire, this was very much something that the Qing authorities could deal with, but not when it came to the introduction of a new type of secret weapon that the British had, namely a steel-clad, it was actually cast iron-clad destroyer, the Nemesis, which then, with the help of its steam engine, could go all the way up the Pearl River into Guangzhou, into Canton City, in order to bombard the garrisons. So at this point, it became clear that the British had the upper hand because of this secret weapon, and they didn't want to give up their superior position. So that's the first Opium War. The second Opium War is actually a slight misnomer. That opium trade became legal after the first Opium War in the so-called unequal treaties of 1840, Treaty of Nanjing. From that point onwards, Westerners were allowed to trade absolutely anything through the treaty ports that were established, namely the 5 ports that went up from Guangzhou into Fujian province, so Xiamen and Fuzhou, and then further up Ningbo and Shanghai. Those treaty ports, together with the colony of Hong Kong, they became the treaty ports which the Westerners used in order to trade, for instance, opium. The Second Opium War is very quickly explained. That was because Western traders, British traders, had used a Chinese barge in order to enter the hinterland with opium, which they were not allowed to do. The coastal defenses of the Long River, the Yangtze River, stopped the vessel, and the British essentially took this as an excuse for forcing the Qing authorities to open up its interior ports, those ports that were along the great rivers that made China accessible. And this is, again, it was very quickly won by the Westerners, this time not because of superior technology, but because the Chinese dynasty was in a bitter warfare with the Taiping forces in the south. And that meant that they had their hands bound and they could simply not respond. So this was a much more complex situation, which also resolved more quickly. But again, it ended up with an unequal treaty, and this treaty allowed the Westerners, especially the French and the British, to enter the interior of China and to do whatever they pleased.
安哥，安哥，有人揾你啊！
你做咩啊？你唔見我食緊煙嘅咩？我都未夠喉啊！我話知佢屋企死人啦，仲唔翻去就餓死晒你屋企啲人啊！咩啊？
It's quite clear from the film that opium was regarded in the film as something problematic. The setting itself is actually quite deceptive, because it is what in the West is described as an opium den, but actually in the practice of the day, an opium establishment could be anything from a very simple hostel to a genuine five-star hotel. And what we see in the film is indeed a five-star hotel. It's an establishment with several floors, and a typical opium hotel, I'll use that term now, would consist of a smoking area, which you find in the main quarters on the first and second floors. The ground floor, you would have tea facilities, tea and food facilities. People would also smoke tobacco, not really opium, because you would need to recline for that. That you had on the first and second, maybe third floors. And then higher up, you had the first signs of abuse or of criminal activity, although it was not, strictly speaking, not criminal. You had areas where you could gamble. And these casinos would, of course, become places where a lot of money could be gained, a lot of money could be lost. And this went hand in hand with the conspicuous consumption of opium in and very expensive foods and alcohol in the top floors of that building. They're sometimes referred to as brothels. They weren't brothels, they were more like escort clubs where very expensive geisha type concubines would accompany very rich gentlemen into rooms where they would do anything from reciting poetry to serving alcohol, but also preparing the pipes that were very important for the consumption of opium. So these multi-story buildings are very well portrayed in this film. It was very, and of course you could also get situations where there was a complete loss of all law and order, and the fact that the Opium Hotel was run by a triad boss is no coincidence, because the absolutely obscene amounts of money that were being burnt, quite literally, went hand in hand with the money that these criminal organizations made through activities that were simply illegal. The film also shows the effect of opium on the social order. For instance, there's a scene when a man, he's the one with the defective eyesight, enters the building and the little house where his family lives, and he has just spent a lot of money on his opium and gambling habits, and his wife, in desperation, has poisoned her children with rat poison. It says, as far as I know, it only says so in Chinese on the packaging. And she herself can be seen hanging, dangling off the ceiling. And the man, after he witnesses the scene, takes his own life by throwing himself onto an open cleaver, a food knife, and he takes his life because this is too much. And all of this caused by the consumption of opium, but also of all the other habits that go along with the consumption of opium, namely gambling and prostitution. And the effect of that was that there was simply no money left in the kitty. So yes, you can see it from both ends of the spectrum, the complete abuse of the financial position of the bosses who do control the opium trade, and then the bottom layer of society. So British India had become reliant on the income that was generated through the opium trade, and this is only true actually for the years between the 1830s and the 1880s, because after the 1880s the Chinese begin to plant opium themselves. They are no longer exclusively reliant on opium, and but it's in these 50 years that the British Empire produces an amount of money through the opium trade that had not been seen before anywhere. So this was to be fair, this was not the doing of the East India Company, because they had been dissolved by that point. So it was very clearly the colonial administration in India that had used the income in order to generate public buildings, public works, infrastructure, but also to finance the enormous administration that it needed to run the empire. And the empire at that point, from the 1860s onwards in any case, stretched all the way from what is nowadays Pakistan, Gujarat, all the way to Burma, which it had incorporated. So by the 1880s, this was an empire that was so expensive to run that the British needed to have a source of income that was commensurate in the financial resources that it generated, which the British administration needed in order to administrate it.
突然間又會唔夠人用都有嘅，成班人上晒煙癮，出貨入貨慢吞吞，死蛇爛鱔咁，我勸極佢哋都唔聽啊！嗰班人又冇錢又學人食福壽糕，好啦，勸唔聽嘅叫佢哋走啊！師傅，傻安同米倉班師兄弟都食埋一份，你鬧下佢哋啊！
It's very important to remember that in the People's Republic, the suppression of opium smoking did not take place overnight. This was something that took more than a decade. And so in the very end of the 1950s, 1957, 8, and then, yes, even after the de facto end of the Great Leap Forward, you had a situation when there was a considerable degree of chaos in the countryside, produced by an artificially generated famine, which cost the lives of tens of millions of people. Again, the numbers are a little bit controversial, but everybody admits that this was one of Mao Zedong's errors. In this situation, the general population took recourse to opium due to one of its properties. Opium is a hunger suppressant. It's something that the coolies discovered in the 19th century when they had to go without food for a whole day sometimes before they were paid at the end of the day and could eat something, because the opium that they consumed was often just so-called dregs. This was ashes that were left in the end. And with these opium dregs, they produced a state of awareness that was alert, where they could use their muscle power, but where they were not really so hungry, that they did not feel so hungry that they would give in to the temptation to stop and have something to eat with money they would possibly have to borrow. The same happened during the end of the Great Leap Forward, when food was simply so scarce that people needed to suppress this sensation of hunger that came up. So to summarize, this was both due to the breakdown in social order that could be observed and control of the Communist Party during this time, and secondly to sheer desperation, because they needed to do something in order to overcome the hunger pangs.
點知佢走咗去？
咁而家傻安喺邊度啊？
仲使問咩？梗係去咗煙館啦！
豈有此理嘅衰仔啊！阿四，我哋抄佢翻嚟。
好，安嫂，你放心啦，我一定幫你揾傻安翻嚟嘅。
The use of opium in the 19th century is seen as as being synonymous with the subjection of China to imperialist colonial rule. So in political terms, at least from 1920s onwards, this becomes a task for, regardless actually of whether it's the communists or the nationalists who are involved, they emphasize the link between the subjugation of the population to smoking opium and the weakening of China as a global power, to the extent that it became something of what is referred to a semi-colony. So not a colonial territory, but a territory where the central administration had less to say than the Western governments. So this is in political terms the consequence. In actual terms, it is seen as opium is seen as a symbol of any kind of drug that could take the population, especially the younger population, away from the duties that they have in order to produce wealth, that is, in order to be able to go to work, but also in moral terms, that they foster a degree of lawlessness, which the film itself actually expresses very well. Because to come back to the film, this is not just a level of lawlessness which is caused by a criminal organization, but by the temptation that the consumption of opium has for the entire population. So whether you have a small job or an enterprise, as soon as opium or drugs are concerned, it leads you on a slippery slope towards lawlessness. And this is also what the government in China today is aware of, and therefore there is anti-drug and symbolized by anti-opium education in schools. You get, especially in formerly opium growing provinces like Sichuan or Yunnan in the southwest, you have people who enter the classrooms in order to show samples so that the children are aware of what the problematic opium poppy looks like.
乜大少做啲咁嘅生意㗎？
鴉片煙係害人嘅，仲會令人消磨壯志添。唔怪得啲外國人叫我哋做東亞病夫。
This is the quintessential essence of the 19th century, that at the same time you saw a lot of progress and wealth and a complete lack of order and lawlessness, which the triads, of course, symbolized. The triads were not the only organization, but they had become, by the late 19th century, the most important organization that on the surface opposed the government, but in actual fact often collaborated with the government. So if you transfer this setting of Hong Kong into Shanghai during the 1920s, 1930s, you would get almost exactly the same environment where the most modern and advanced technology and signs of progress went hand in hand with the chaos and daily lawlessness that that criminal organization like the Triads had produced. Du Yeshang in Shanghai has the same appeal as the leader of the Triad that you get in this film. Of course, in this film you have a beautiful combination of Chinese customs such as the martial arts, which very clearly are used in order to to romanticize this era. But if you think about it in terms of nostalgia for the good old times, there's a very bittersweet taste to the life that is demonstrated in this film, because very simply it shows a bygone age which is dominated by crime and by a social order that had at least as many shadowy sides as it had appeal.
老大，你點啊？我煙癮又發作，我都係唔得噶啦。師傅，煙啊！
From the Chinese side, it's very clear. This was Hong Kong symbolized the so-called national humiliation, which the Opium War had started, and for leading politicians such as Deng Xiaoping, it was actually clear that the only way to conclude this period of national humiliation would actually be to insist on the return of Hong Kong as a crown colony. The other prizes that the foreigners had taken in as a result of the Opium War, the two Opium Wars, namely the treaty ports and the right to trade within China as they wanted to, establish headquarters in China as they wanted to, that had already ceded with the revolution of 1949. But even if the nationalists had stayed in power, the right of the Westerners to do what they wanted would already have receded. And by the way, the nationalists who are in power in Taiwan today, they also wanted to see the return of Hong Kong. So it's not just something that the communists had cooked up. Were the Hong Kong people in favor? Well, you have to ask the people of Hong Kong themselves. You will find a generational split, with many younger people becoming nostalgic for the days of the British colony, but many of the older people actually being very keen on seeing Hong Kong as part of China. And then, of course, also you have to think that Hong Kong has always been in change, in a state of flux. And what is going on in Hong Kong today is, of course, against the background of an erosion of the democratic rights that the post-colony had for some time. During the colonial era, it was a colony. It did not have any rights. It was as simple as that. You could publish what you wanted because nobody cared, but as long as you did not publish against the British colonial government. So what you find today is a nostalgia for a type of lifestyle rather than that of democratic rights that certainly didn't exist during the 19th century or during the first part of the 20th century. So it's a complicated question, but opium in Hong Kong, well, we had the British who had who said that they were keen to suppress the customs with a opium regime, which again was meant to encourage opium users to register. In actual practice, they did very little. So opium and opiates, especially heroin, became one of the hallmarks of Hong Kong, and the British administration did not favor it. They had police campaigns against it, but they were so lax, you can say, that it became quite clear that they were not really capable of suppressing this trade, and they were also not capable of suppressing the triads that were very active, at least during the 1950s and 60s and 70s. So this is also something that you get in the Bruce Lee films. Very clear reminder how this 19th century setting that we have in this film is actually also followed by 20th century settings that dwell on exactly the same connection.
你真係害人啊！你害死太多